Hey, it's Jack. Sitting with me is my friend Joe Fye. He's got a podcast, Radio Free BTC. Joe, what is your podcast about?
Bitcoin.
That's cool. Do you cover other things like Minnesota politics?
Bitcoin.
What about national politics?
Bitcoin.
Do you ever get into sports? I don't talk about it a lot, but people love sports. Do you ever talk about sports?
Bitcoin.
Okay. There you have it. If you want a podcast about only Bitcoin, download Radio Free BTC wherever podcasts are sold.
It's the Jack Tomczak Show.
Good afternoon, Twin Cities. Up and let's go. Welcome to the Jack Tomczak Show. On the second hour of the show, we're going to have a podcaster in who does a show completely on Bitcoin. And his name is Joe Fye. And I know nothing about Bitcoin, even though I've talked with him a bunch of times. So hopefully this conversation, maybe I'll understand some of it. But before that, we're going to have in studio now, we have Richard Painter, who MinnPost tells me might be running for governor against Tim Walz as an independent. Hi, Richard. How are you?
Well, hello, Jack. How are you doing? I'm doing
all right.
well.
Now, listeners, longtime listeners of me may remember that you were a former ethics lawyer in the George W. Bush White House. And from then, you were critical of former President Trump when he was in office, and you ran for the Senate on the DFL side in 2018, and now looking at being an independent and running for governor. Bring us all up to speed on how you came to this decision.
My own political evolution moved from being a Republican to being an independent. I was a Republican for 30 years up through 2018. But left the Republican Party because of my strong disagreement, not only with the policies and personality of Donald Trump, but the insistence in the Republican Party on loyalty to Donald Trump. I am an independent. In Minnesota, you are allowed to enter the primaries, even though you're not registered with a party. We don't register with the parties. And so I entered the DFL primary for the United States Senate, ran against Tina Smith. In that primary, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party establishment made it very clear that I was not welcome in that primary, and that unless I swore loyalty to the DFL, and that includes all the party bosses, Ken Martin, and the rest of them, they were going to see to it that I was defeated. And that was their message, that no one is welcome in a DFL primary unless they swear they're a Democrat. I'm an independent. I believe that Governor Walz has not done an adequate job as governor in a number of respects, everything from protecting clean water in the state to his handling of the policing crisis and education, a number of issues that I believe are not being handled well by Governor Walz, and there needs to be a challenge. We'll see who the Republicans come up with. But I believe that having a third party independent candidate in this race would be a good idea.
Now, you mentioned, pardon me, clean water, education, and policing. I think listeners are super aware of the policing problem in Minnesota, specifically Minneapolis and St. Paul, especially last year with both of those cities being on fire. And certainly these listeners are aware of that. In regard to Governor Walz falling short on education, can you expand on that?
Well, we spend an enormous amount of money in the state of Minnesota on education, higher education. We also spend quite a bit on K through 12. The question is, are we delivering? And are we delivering? Let's start with the university level, the college level. We used to be able to have kids go to school in Minnesota for reasonable tuition. Tuition at the University of Minnesota is 3 times what it was when Arne Carlson was governor. That's 20 years ago. Yeah. 3 times. How many families were making 3 times as much money as they were in the year 2000? Tuitions are out of control. And that is in large part because of excessive spending at the university. I'm an employee of the university, so is my wife. We enjoy our jobs at the university, but there are a lot of people working there. Making a lot of money, including the university president, makes $800,000 a year. That's 4 times the governor's pay, and massive bureaucracy. And the cost is just way, way too high. We need to bring the cost of higher education back down to the levels that we had in this country in the 1960s, 70s, early 80s. We don't need Bernie Sanders to have free college in America. We actually got there, or very close to free or low-cost public education, public higher education in the United States. And then somehow we decided to let the university spend as much money as they wanted, jack their tuitions up through the roof. And here we are. A lot of families in Minnesota can't afford to send their kids to college. We need to fix that. We need a governor who's going to take a leadership role on that. We've also had corruption in the election of the regents of the University of Minnesota. There was a political action committee founded by two former presidents of the university and several current regents of the university. I believe with some support from DFL members of the state legislature. This political action committee called the Maroon and Gold PAC was giving money to members of the legislature in order to influence the election of new regents, and to boot off the Board of Regents, a man named Michael Sue, who had objected to a culture of non-compliance. And Michael Sue had also insisted the students be given back their room and board after COVID-19 hit, and they got kicked out of the dorms. Seems to me that if you pay room and board and you get kicked out of the dorm, maybe you ought to get your money back.
Yep.
Well, this goes on and on. So the bottom line is we need some reform of higher ed in this state. We also need to look seriously at adequately funding occupational education, training people for the trades, community college, and we need to fund real education, not a bunch of indoctrination and a bunch of bureaucrats who are just sit around pushing paper. And so there's a lot of work to be done, and Governor Walz isn't doing it.
Now, you said that this Maroon and Gold PAC gave money to DFL politicians to influence a regent election. Did I get that right?
Well, they took care of some Republicans too, but I will say that they are more closely tied with the DFLers than on the Republican side. They try to spread their money equally in order to influence the two parties. But the bottom line is that there's some very close ties in the state capitol with DFLers, and a lot of the people behind it have been influential in Minnesota politics. As say, both parties implicated, but I sense more of a DFL presence there.
Now, when you say gave money, is this handing sacks of cash to politicians, which is illegal, or is it spending money through the free speech route and supporting the politicians they like to remain in office?
It's giving money to a PAC, so it's legal. But the question is whether regents of the university and former presidents of the university should be giving money to politicians for the purpose of influencing the election of new regents who will agree with them, and targeting a man on the board of regents who had criticized the culture of non-compliance at the university. One of the things Michael Sue did that really upset them was he objected when they came out with a report on renaming 4 university buildings named after some administrators in the 1930s who were accused of being involved with segregated housing at the university. And Michael Sue said, I'm going to actually read the report, and the research was terribly sloppy. So these men were being accused of various things they didn't do. These men who long since died, they have 4 buildings named after them, with respect to racial segregation. You want to rename buildings, and I know there's a lot of that going on around the country now, but you get your facts right. You don't just put out a report trashing somebody's name and their descendants are still around living in this state and saying things they didn't do, and then say that's why you're going to take the name off the building. So Michael Sue spoke out about that, and they got mad at him over that. Mm-hmm. They got mad at him for insisting the students actually be given their money back after COVID-19 on the room and board, and it goes on and on. But should a political action committee be formed by regents of the university and 2 former presidents of the university for purposes of funding the election of new regents and targeting of a regent who was a dissenter? And I strongly object to that.
So how did that go? Michael Sue, was he successfully ousted?
Successfully ousted by 1 vote.
Okay.
And so these political action committees make a difference. and the culture of noncompliance continues. And this is the kind of thing that drives up the cost of tuition. We don't have oversight from the Board of Regents. The Board of Regents just constantly wants to spend more money, raise tuition, but they aren't performing their oversight role. Mr. Sue was actually chastised by the chairman of the Board of Regents for complaining to the press about a culture of noncompliance. Seems to me that that's exactly what a director of a company or a director of a nonprofit or a university region ought to do. If they see noncompliance, they ought to say something.
From the outside, it seems like, you're painting with a very broad brush here, that higher education is a mess. I went to the U and did not have to, when I went to the U, it was more expensive. College was more expensive than it was when my dad went to college, 30 years before that. But it seems now that and I paid off my school loans in short order, but it seems now that like going to college it's going to cost you quite possibly an arm and a leg. And from what, at least the media that I've consumed on the internet, it's telling me that dissent is not encouraged or appreciated at universities, and it's more indoctrinating, or at least doesn't foster a community of openness and debate, which is, I thought, what college was for. How much of what I'm seeing in pop culture and at least right-wing media about college is accurate?
Well, I think some of this is accurate. First of all, as I say, there's an enormous amount of money being spent, and a lot of time spent on activities that are not directly related to education. That are really more about politicization of the academic mission, and it's a serious problem. I'm going to emphasize that despite all my concerns about the University of Minnesota, that it's better here than a lot of places.
Yeah.
And I will also emphasize that part of our problem is an extreme concentration of wealth in this country, not just for individuals, but for educational institutions. So we have institutions such as Harvard with a $50 billion endowment, or the University of Pennsylvania with an enormous endowment, educating relatively few students, sitting on a lot of money, including a lot of federal money that goes in there. So they can say they're private all they want. They're taking a lot of money from the government. So for example, president of the University of Pennsylvania made $4 million a year.
Yeesh.
She also raised money from China and from Saudi Arabia, according to the Philadelphia Inquirer, hundreds of millions of dollars. And some money, we don't know where from, was raised for the Biden Center. She appointed Joe Biden as a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in 2017, as he was starting a presidential campaign as a professor, and he made $911,000. I think he showed up one or two times. I don't know.
Good work if you can get it. All right, hang on.
911,000.
We got to stop for a break. We will come back in a moment. I'm talking with Richard Painter, potentially a candidate for governor, a gubernatorial candidate for governor as an independent. You're listening to the Jack Tomczak Show on AM 1280 The Patriot. Welcome back to the Jack Tomczak Show. I'm talking with Richard Painter, former ethics attorney for the George W. Bush White House and one-time DFL candidate for the Senate in 2018, and now a gubernatorial candidate for governor as an independent. We were talking about, Richard's a professor at the U, and we're talking about right now college being crazy expensive, private schools being ridiculously expensive, and getting money from the federal government, even though they're supposed to be private. And Richard, you're telling a story about Joe Biden getting a cush job at, was it Harvard?
University of Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, that's public.
Philadelphia. Yeah, crucial swing state there.
Yes, it is. $900,000 to, he went to one meeting?
Professor, he was appointed as the Benjamin Franklin Professor of Presidential Practice for $911,000, 2017, 18, I believe, into 19. I don't know if he came and gave one or two lectures. I don't know what he did as the Benjamin Franklin Professor of Presidential Practice, but $911,000 is a lot of money.
Yeah.
And well, then they have the Biden Center there. And then Amy Gutmann, the president of the University of Pennsylvania, makes $4 million a year. And guess what? She is now the nominee to be ambassador to Germany.
It's funny how that works out.
Yeah, it's funny how it works out. So she's the nominee to be ambassador to Germany. And the chairman of the board of trustees of the University of Pennsylvania, a man named Mike Cohen, who is a lobbyist for Comcast, he helped sign off on all this as chairman of the board of trustees of the University of Pennsylvania, and he has been nominated to be the ambassador to Canada.
Huh.
So we have the Philadelphia power couple is now apparently going to be representing the United States. The Comcast man, Mike Cohen, he, I assume, will try to export Comcast up there to Canada, and so they can pay the same sky-high rates that we pay Comcast here, given their monopoly power, but that's a whole other story.
Mhm.
But it ties into this general concern, extreme concentration of power and of wealth in the educational establishment. You have outfits like the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, amassing enormous amounts of money, having lots of influence with the federal government. Companies like Comcast with monopoly power, of course, have the ties to get what they want. This man, Mike Cohen, is the ambassadorial nominee to Canada, had one of the first Biden fundraisers there at his big mansion in Philadelphia. So the question is, where does that leave states like Minnesota? Where does that leave us? And we need a governor who's going to fight for us in Washington as well as at home. And I know we have two senators. I don't know what they're doing all the time, but we need to have people fighting for us in Washington. So money, from federal money from that infrastructure plan, that's coming here. And the federal government's going to have to stop subsidizing these ultra-rich universities and help make college affordable for American kids who don't necessarily go to the fancy places, but who want to go to the University of Minnesota, any of our campuses, or to a trade school, or to community college. And college, higher education is unaffordable for
Now,
most families.
If you ask somebody at the University of Minnesota who isn't you about college being affordable or not, they would say that it is not affordable, and that's why we need the state legislature to send more money to the University of Minnesota. They say that every time, they get money every time, and college is still unaffordable.
Well,
What
is
hope-
that usually works. If somebody asks for money, you give them money, they spend the money. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean they're going to lower the tuition. I
What
mean, what
will
you
work
really
to
need
lower
to do,
tuition?
yeah, what you really need to do is put the money in the budget to lower the tuition and say to the university, they got to start spending money. You do not need to have the dean of political correctness, the associate dean of political correctness, the assistant dean of political correctness, the assistant to the associate dean of political correctness, and they're preparing massive reports on I don't know what. We do need to make college education affordable for every Minnesotan. We need to attract students from diverse backgrounds and to our university. There is absolutely no place for racism in a university. And I am the first person to say it's absolutely critical that we make sure that racism is never tolerated at the University of Minnesota. But we do not need to hire dozens of bureaucrats to do that. And that's what's happened here, is they hire dozens of bureaucrats, massive reports, investigations that go on for years. And then, by the way, they let the faculty get away with stuff that students never could get away with. Tenured professors getting away with harassment and all sorts of problems. And, you know, the burden, and the Trump administration, one of the few things the Trump administration did that made sense, they told these universities that you had to apply the same standard of proof to professors as you did to students. So if a professor gets accused of something, if you're going to kick a student out on preponderance of the evidence, you better be ready to take a professor out and fire him on preponderance of the evidence. You don't say, well, we're going to throw a student out on some claim. And yet, well, if it's a professor, if it's a tenured professor, you know, oh, gee, it's got to be clear and convincing evidence, or evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Because what that does is it sets up an environment you have in many of these universities. And it's not unique to Minnesota, it's around the country. We have tenured professors who are getting away with harassment, sexual harassment, and other things like that. And then massive amounts of time and money spent going after students for small stuff. And that escalated a lot in the Obama years when the Obama administration put the heat on the universities to start addressing student conduct without, of course, funding any of it. So massive bureaucracies.
What can you tell me? I think this ties into the dean of political correctness, the assistant dean of political correctness, and what is allowed on college campuses. What can you tell me about these Students for a Democratic Society? That's a group at the U, right?
They've been around. They've been around since the 60s. They're sort of a socialist type of organization. They've been around since the 60s. I don't know what they're doing these days. I think they have some Marxist. You always had trouble figuring out the difference between them and the Spartacus Youth League, which I guess was the hardcore communists. And then you got the SDS, and then you got there are a whole bunch of these different types of outfits. But I might recommend students spend more time studying and getting that degree and getting out there in the workplace than horsing around with outfits like that.
Okay. How are we learned from earlier in the conversation, former Regent Michael Sue was not treated well because of his and was eventually ousted by efforts from some former presidents and other regents because he was advocating for students to get their money back who were not allowed to live in the dorms even though they paid for it when things shut down because of COVID-19. How is dissent treated at universities specifically around COVID-19? Because the country is split in half on this, and families are getting torn apart, people are losing friendships, and how are college campuses handling this, and the U, if you've got direct experience with that?
The UK, I think the U was reasonably fish. I mean, the biggest problem was the failure to give the students the money back and to the students have had a whole year in which a lot of them couldn't get jobs.
Okay.
And, a lot of these students depend on part-time income to cover the costs. And I believe we should have cut the tuition in the following year. I mean, we're in a time of extreme economic hardship for students in particular. And people just starting now to be able to get jobs and making the $15 an hour or whatever. But we went through a whole year in which students didn't have any source of income. And I don't think the university was cognizant of that problem. And we need to understand what the students are really worried about. And it's, can I afford to go to college, get a diploma, and get a job with a diploma? And that means being taught something you can use on the job, not being taught of so much of critical theory stuff. Being taught something you can use on the job to get a job. And that's what our young people want in this country. And that's what young people want in Minnesota.
How much influence does the governor of Minnesota have over the workings of the University of Minnesota system? Like if you become governor, what can you do about these problems that you've witnessed as a professor at the U?
I believe what we need to do is implement a plan in this state to get tuition in real dollars back to where it was in 1980.
How do you do that?
And that means significant cuts in spending and some increases in the allocation for higher ed, but increases that go directly into subsidizing tuition and cutting spending at the university. And all of our campuses, we need efficiency. And we need to figure out a way, if we can do it in 1980, why can't we do it now? What has happened in this country that we used to be able to have affordable higher education in public universities? And it isn't just what the Democrats say is you need to give more money to the universities. It's the spending, the amount of money that's being spent.
Yeah.
How much money is going?
I think
efficiency.
I think with colleges,
that budget, they will figure out a way to do it. But you cut the budget, but you also cut the tuition. You cut the budget, you leave the tuition up there, then you're just saying to both the students and the university, we're abandoning you. But if you say we're cutting the tuition and the spending is going to go down, how about let's start with the president of the university shouldn't make more than the governor. And
that's a good place to start.
If I become the governor, I want to make what the president of the university makes. Governor Walz is making plenty of money. And I don't think any governor needs to get any more than what he's getting.
Yeah.
The question is,
go ahead.
Yeah, should the president of the university make $800,000 a year? And then she gets her 800,000 because she can appoint to Joe Biden's friend, Amy Gutman at University of Pennsylvania, who made 4 million. And what my answer is, this is a public institution.
Mhm.
And this is Minnesota. This is not Pennsylvania. And we don't need a president of the university who's best friends with the president of the United States. Yes, I know that helps bring in a lot of money. That's the way they do business out east. We need to have an affordable higher education for every single Minnesotan. We need to roll those tuitions back to where they were, at least when Arnie Carlson left office in year 2000. And I believe it's a long-term plan. We need to get back where this country was in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s with the tuitions at those levels in real dollars. We need to do what we were doing then. We don't need Bernie Sanders for free college in America. We need a little bit more Dwight D. Eisenhower.
All right, let's take a very quick break. You're listening to the Jack Tomzak Show on AM 1280 The Patriot. Welcome back to the Jack Tomzak Show. I'm talking with Richard Painter, former ethics attorney for the George W. Bush White House, and now might be running for governor as an independent. He's a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School. Richard, right?
Yes.
And we were talking about his plan to bring tuition down at the University of Minnesota. One of the other things you mentioned about, as far as Governor Tim Walz falling short, it was clean water, education, policing. Let's get into clean water. How has Governor Walz fallen short, and how would you not fall short if you were elected governor?
Well, we've been doing mining in Minnesota for a long time, iron mining, taconite mining, and the economy up north for decades was very dependent on mining. And there are fewer opportunities in iron mining, taconite mining, and there's been talk about a completely different kind of mining, which is called sulfide mining, to try and go after copper and nickel deep underground, right there near the boundary waters. This is a very likely environmental disaster. You loosen up that hard rock down there and try and get the copper and nickel, and you free all that up into the, gets into the water. Hard rock mining is something that can be done for copper and nickel away from large waterways. Do it down in Arizona, there are plenty of places to do it. But trying that in northern Minnesota, we are very likely to pollute permanently the boundary waters of the Lake Superior watershed. There are many, and those mines would only create maybe 300 jobs. We ought to create a lot more jobs in northern Minnesota, but not through mining, not through sulfide mining. We need to help people start businesses up there, encourage the growth of business, have internet access throughout Minnesota, broadband access, high-speed broadband access. Hopefully some of this infrastructure bill will help pay for that. We also need to think seriously about how many bureaucrats are we going to have working for the state of Minnesota in the Twin Cities. We have a government, a state government that people pay for all over the state for their income taxes and their property taxes. But there's, once again, a lot of concentration of employment by the state of Minnesota in St. Paul and in the Twin Cities. Former Governor Arnie Carlson told me that if you just moved one state agency up there to the Iron Range, you could create more jobs than one of these sulfide mines. And these two sulfide mines, they've been talking about for 20 years.
Yep.
One's called Twin Metals, the other one Polymet. And for 20 years, the only jobs being created by those mine companies have been for lawyers and lobbyists. The stock for Polymet is down 90% over the past decade. So the investors got ripped off. The company is controlled by Glencore, which is a Swiss mining conglomerate. It was founded by Mark Rich, who was given a pardon by presidential pardon by Clinton for tax evasion, and a company that's very close to Vladimir Putin. I mean, do we want these people mining in northern Minnesota, particularly sulfide mining? So, we need a governor who's going to protect our waterways and work with the business leaders and the legislators from northern Minnesota to come up with a plan to get more jobs into the area without depending on the sulfide mining industry, which has promised a lot of jobs they've never produced because their plans are environmentally unsound.
Now, where is Tim Walz on that? We have been talking about this for 20 years, and back in the old radio days, we talked about this a lot more than I've talked about it recently, so it might not be up to speed. But where is Tim Walz on Twin Metals and Polymet?
He doesn't want to talk about it.
Oh,
See,
that's
the
convenient.
Republicans, I don't agree with the Republicans, but the Republicans are mostly for it. Okay, so they're going to say they're for it. At least I don't agree with them, but they're willing to say they're for it. They're going to give their arguments why they're for it. I'm giving my arguments why I'm against it. But Tim Walz, he's against it when he's with the environmentalists. He's for it when he's with the mining companies who are giving some money in the back door and the labor unions. And I mean, it's like trying to stick Jello on a wall here,
Mhm.
trying to pin him down on the mining issue. There's nothing happening there. I mean, you get no answer. And when they say, well, we're just going to let the process play itself out. All this process is done for 20 years in rich lawyers and lobbyists. The longer you drag some decisions like this out, the more the politicians standing there putting their hand out, asking for money. And the lawyers are running on up the courts of the Minnesota Supreme Court, back on down again. It goes on and on and on.
Why do you hate lawyers, Richard?
Lawyers is a wonderful business being a lawyer. Don't mind making money, but I also see other lawyers out there making money, creating a lot of ruckus.
Yeah.
And
So the precious metals that Twin Metals and Polymet wants to mine for are the stuff that we use in our cell phones and our TVs and our laptops. And the argument that they've given on this is that wouldn't you rather have those things mined here where there are environmental protections as opposed to in China where there aren't any environmental protections, and Mother Earth will get polluted if it doesn't happen in this country. And since it's in the Iron Range, let's go dig it up.
well, I have to say, as the governor of Minnesota, I'm going to focus first and foremost on the clean water in Minnesota, and let the People's Republic of China take care of itself in that regard. When it comes to, of course, air pollution, we got a bigger problem with the People's Republic of China because they can pour all sorts of carbon into the air and contribute to the global warming problem, and then tell us we're the ones who have to cut back the emissions. Well, they don't. But on the clean water issue, I got to say that our job is here to protect clean water in Minnesota. Now let's talk about the copper and nickel. Where is it going to go? So Polymet is majority controlled, over 80% of it controlled by Glencore, the Swiss mining conglomerate, where the CEO received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from not the President of the United States, but from Vladimir Putin, because they were dealing a lot with Rusal and some other big Russian oligarch metals trading companies. I have my suspicions where the copper and nickel might end up going, and I don't think it's necessarily going to be in a cell phone of someone living in the Twin Cities. We could very well be in a situation similar to what has happened for centuries, where and the European powers are very good at doing this in Africa and throughout the Americas. And we go and you exploit another country for their natural resources, you strip them bare, you get it out cheap, and then you leave an environmental mess behind. And that's what Glencore has been doing in Africa, in lots of places, all over Africa. So you could easily have a situation where the copper and nickel, it ends up in the hands of the Russians, and we end up with the dirty water. And how many mining jobs do we get? 200 or 300 mining jobs. And a lot of mining is high tech these days. These mines, they'll bring in their own people to handle the high tech stuff and get the good pay. What do we need? We need a plan for economic growth in northern Minnesota that involves encouraging the growth of businesses, particularly broadband internet. You could do anything you want up there. You could trade stocks, trade securities with London and Tokyo with an office in Hibbing. All you need is a computer and high speed internet. It's a very different economy. You don't need to be dependent on resource extraction in northern Minnesota. It's a beautiful place to live, a lot less of a hassle to live in much of northern Minnesota than it is to live down in the Twin Cities. And more jobs, you do it on your computer. As we learned in the pandemic, how much you can do at home on your computer.
Yeah. Yep.
And you can do it up there. People can start businesses, make a ton of money. This idea, you got to go down there, look for the copper and nickel for some company controlled by Putin's friends over in Switzerland. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I gotta tell you, the pandemic happening has opened at least my eyes and a lot of the people who come from rural America who would love to go back but can't make a living in rural America. And I still don't know if government is the answer on rural broadband, because I'm not a big fan of government doing things. But I think there's got to be a ton of people who would love to make their Twin Cities metropolitan area paycheck and live in a small town where the woods is right outside their front door.
Well, say I did it for a year teaching my classes. The university has to teach the classes on the computer.
Yeah.
Through Zoom. So I taught my classes the way we're doing it now. Lawyers are now taking depositions on Zoom, and instead of getting on the airplane and increasing the carbon footprint there, do everything on Zoom. You can do a lot with broadband internet, and you could run a consulting business. You can run an investment bank out of northern Minnesota. You could right there in Ely. You could have an investment bank and be doing deals, say with London, Tokyo, and Berlin, right up there. You don't need to be sitting down in the Twin Cities. So there's an enormous opportunity. We need the broadband internet in there. And I think that's a key infrastructure component. But the rest of it, the private sector can take care of.
All right, let's take a break before I'm going to segue into policing, because that was one of the three things you mentioned that Governor Tim Walz has fallen short on. And we'll come back with that after the break. You're listening to the Jack Tomczak Show on AM 1280, The Patriot. Welcome back to the Jack Tomczak Show. I'm talking with Richard Painter, former George W. Bush White House ethics attorney, and is thinking about running for governor against Governor Tim Walz as an independent. And we've covered a handful of issues thus far, and got a couple more things I want to ask, but let's touch on policing. That was one of the three things you said, Richard, that Governor Tim Walz has fallen short on. He said clean water, education, and policing. It's obvious if you looked at Minneapolis last year that policing is a mess, and Governor Tim Walz did nothing to help, at least then. How do you think Tim Walz has failed in regard to policing, and what would you do differently if you were elected governor?
Well, this problem predates Tim Walz by a long time.
Okay.
The problems we've had with policing have been in our major cities. They've been run by Democratic Farmer Labor Party politicians for decades.
Mm-hmm.
Minneapolis, St. Paul, and then some of the surrounding cities as well. And this is where we have a situation where you have a vast majority of the police officers are not only doing their job competently, but they are doing their job heroically. They're good people and not racist and not violent. But in every group, you're going to have a handful who don't know how to handle their work. And someone like Derek Chauvin, he shouldn't have been on the police force. They should have gotten him out of there a lot faster. And he's not the typical police officer. And for anyone to imply that the majority of the police officers behave that way is absolutely just wrong, slanderous. But we do need to be able to get rid of the bad police officers, just like we need to be able to get rid of bad teachers. And we get rid of bad people in the Army. It's a lot easier to get rid of someone who doesn't know what they're doing in the Army, or at least give them a desk job where they're harmless, than it is to get rid of a bad police officer or a bad teacher.
Yeah,
and it's a lot of the same problems we have teacher tenure. And we got to affect tenure for police officers and a union that made it very difficult to remove the bad guys.
Yeah.
And that really makes it hard for the other police officers who are trying to do their job well. And what we've had is DFL, mayors, and city councils that have done nothing to stand up to the union, and they won't stand up to teachers' unions, they won't stand up to police unions, and figure out a way to get the bad guys out so we can pay more for the good police officers, of which there are a lot. And we need to fund the police, not defund the police.
Yeah, that's one thing that frustrates me with how Republicans look at police, is that whenever there's an incident, people on quote unquote my side, their knee-jerk reaction is to side with the cop, and that cops are always right. And nothing. There's only one absolute, and that there are no absolutes.
Yeah, the problem is you're going to have bad officers, just like I say, you have Democrats that side with the teachers all the time. Well, some of the teachers aren't right. They're teaching crazy stuff, or once in a while you have somebody who is really mistreating the kids. But if there were a story of a teacher who, let's say, molested the kids, you wouldn't say, "Well, defund the public schools."
Right.
You get rid of that, and you wouldn't say, "Well, that's how everyone else is behaving." No, you get rid of the people who are dangerous, but you don't defund the schools, you don't defund the police. I mean, that's absolutely crazy. So you got this situation where the DFL is running the cities and the city councils, and they were ignoring a lot of this problem. And then you have somebody gets killed. And it's I saw this after Philando Castillo got killed over in Falcon Heights. They had a city council meeting, and a city council member who is a lawyer, who works for the University of Minnesota, not the law school, but a lawyer, said, I used to be on the city council. When I was on the city council, I knew about racial profiling, and I said nothing and did nothing, and I blame my white privilege. And I'm sitting there thinking, wait a minute, there's nothing to do with white privilege. That's just stupidity.
Yeah, that's just, you're bad at your job.
Yeah, if you're sitting on a city council of Falcon Heights and you know about racial profiling, and you say nothing, do nothing, you're a lawyer? What's going on here? And the point is, if this person knew, other people in the city council knew they had a problem. They needed to address that problem. That was their job before Philando Castillo was killed. What did they do? Nothing. And then they come in and they moan about white privilege, and you get all this talk that has nothing to do with the problem. The problem is there are a few cops who aren't doing their job the way they ought to be doing it. That ought to be addressed, but we don't defund the police. We don't go into the city council meeting and say, oh, gee, I didn't say anything because, well, it's my white privilege. No, we do our job and we expect others to do their job. So terrible mismanagement. Then everything blows up in summer 2020. And it took Governor Walz a while to get control of things. I mean, you can't just have people burning down the police station. And this thing goes on for a number of days. Eventually got under control. But the biggest disaster we've had was that the crime rate has skyrocketed. And the vast majority of the victims of these crimes are poor people, a lot of them minorities in Minneapolis, extremely high crime rate in North Minneapolis, children being killed, many children of color being killed. And the bottom line is the politicians don't care. So they did, in fact, defund the police, but they defunded the police by pulling them out of North Minneapolis.
As governor, what can you do? And what would you do as governor?
One, you do need to increase the budget for policing at the state and local level. You need to reform the police. This goes back to what Teddy Roosevelt did when he's the police commissioner in New York over 100 years ago, when there's some problems in the police department. You don't get rid of the police department. You fund it and you reform it. And you've got to have a system for getting rid of the people like Derek Chauvin.
So can that happen? Like for the Minneapolis Police Department, can the state reform how a city's police department operates?
By passing statutes, we could pass the statutes through the legislature and also put pressure on the city. I mean, what's happening now is no pressure on the city because the city's run by a Democratic governor. I mean, Democratic mayor, you got a Democratic farmer labor governor, and nobody wants to mess with the police union. Even the police union was pro-Trump because Democrats never want to mess with a union.
Yeah.
You just don't mess with unions. That's one thing I was told at DFL. If you get into their primary, never get in a fight with a union. And what I did, the first thing I did was go get in a fight with a union.
Well, what I picked up from our conversation, Richard, is that Republicans will like you because you are not a big fan of unions sometimes, and Republicans will agree with you on policing. They'll agree with you on education, and Democrats will not agree with you on those things. But Democrats will like your stance on clean water. And who's your base for this potential election? And I got a minute and a half, by the way.
Well, I think the average Minnesotan sees things pretty much right down the middle. And, you know, they understand there was racism in policing, and we're not going to deny it. But that's not true of the vast majority of cops. We need to reform policing. Higher education is important, and we should fund higher education. But we need to get the tuition down rather than just spending more money. And when it comes to our most precious natural resource, which is water, yeah, I'm a conservative. I want to conserve the planet. I want to conserve our natural resources. And I'd like to encourage the growth of small business and bring in other opportunities for people up north. And one thing I would do is fight for Minnesota against the increasing concentration of wealth in this country in places other than Minnesota, where we have huge banks and very ultra-rich universities and others who have a lot of influence over the administration in Washington, over Congress. And the question is, who's speaking up for Minnesota and for Minnesotans' values?
All right, 30 seconds left. Right now, you're thinking about running for governor. At what point will you be making a decision about running for governor?
I'll look at it over the next month or two, probably, and decide which way to go. But I want to think about, can I bring the conversation in this state to focus on issues,
All right.
not on conspiracy theories and not on antagonism between the two political parties and the Democrats and the Republicans trashing each other, but on real issues, on the bread and butter issues that matter to Minnesotans and environmental issues that we all care about.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Richard Painter. And do me a favor, when you announce, come on my show and announce it here.
I will do that.
Thank you.
Absolutely.